Next up, we have Dr. Marianne Moore, who is an assistant professor in animal ecology in the Science and Mathematics Department at Arizona State University. Marianne's research uses ecological, physiological, immunological, and evolutionary tools to examine relationships between wildlife and their pathogens or diseases. In Arizona, she launched a multi-year field-based study to describe hibernation traits in desert Southwest bats to help predict potential future impacts of white nose syndrome on these populations. And white nose syndrome is something that is a fungal infection that has been highly problematic in the United States. She joined our bat monitoring program as a principal investigator in her first year at Arizona State University in 2015-2016 and has worked with us ever since. So welcome back, Dr. Marianne Moore, and go ahead and load your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
And can you see my slide right now? Yes? Great, thank you. Okay. Right, so thank you so much for having me. Definitely, this has been a pleasure all along working with the folks of the McDowell Conservancy. And I'm going to talk to you today about a project that has become multi-year and could become a very long-term monitoring effort of bat populations on the preserve. So the question I'm kind of try and answer, at least to begin with today, is what drives bats to use Dixie mine, which is an abandoned mine in sort of a very special place on the preserve. And I'll be discussing some patterns of emergence, the possibility that seasonality, as well as some climactic factors, may drive the presence of bats at that site. I want to first off say that this has taken a huge amount of effort starting in 2015-16, trying to understand where the bats are in this general vicinity, determine which methods we can use to monitor them, and to develop our own sort of very rigorous protocol with the intent of trying to publish this data set. So this is a collaboration between myself as faculty at ASU, the McDowell Sonoran Conservancy. Some of our efforts have more recently been funded through the Heritage Program at Arizona Game and Fish. And we participate in the NA BAT program, which is a continental-wide effort. Lots and lots of people involved. Debbie Langenfeld is definitely the primary citizen scientist who has been involved from the beginning. She and I worked very heavily in the field together, developing the protocol. Lots of students from ASU, Tiffany Sprague, Jesse Dwyer, citizen scientists, Carrie Means, people counting bats, John Griffin. And this isn't everybody, but this does include everybody from the last few years, which is what I'm presenting you today. So if you're unfamiliar with Dixie Mine, it is on the preserve, on the Scottsdale's McDowell Sonoran Preserve. It is unusual in that it's riparian habitat. There are cottonwoods. There appears to be water year-round, probably inside the mine. So it's an important conservation area for a lot of animals, not just bats. We do see zone-tailed hawks in the area, ringtails, foxes, coyotes, mountain lions, rattlesnakes, lots of different vertebrates for sure, and invertebrates. The mine itself is closed, and so that does make it good and protective for bats that may choose to live there or roost there, although there has been some vandalizing in the last couple of years, which makes it a little bit easier for humans to get inside. It has been known as a bat roost site since 1981, and Arizona Game and Fish previously identified it as an active maternity colony. That was in 1992. And what we mean by an active maternity colony is that this is where bat species, females of the species, will congregate to give birth and raise their young And this is something that is quite well known for bats generally. This just gives you an idea of an aerial view. So you can see the wash with cottonwoods lining it. The whiter splotch is actually a vertical entrance into the mine. That is not where we trap or watch emergences. We watch emergences from a more horizontal exit. Okay, and so why should we study bats at Dixie Mine? We can answer this question generally and specifically. If you want to think about bats overall, across the world, 80% of bat species are in need of some conservation efforts or research attention. That's according to the IUCN. Bats are often, misunderstood, ignored, or persecuted. They're nocturnal, they're harder to study. Many people fear them and might actively try and eradicate them if they do find them. But bats provide very important critical ecosystem services, in part including, this is not an exhaustive list, but pest control by eating agricultural pests, pollinating important plants, and dispersing seeds. They may also be very good as sort of indicator of changes occurring on the landscape that may be due to climate change, urbanization, or other environmental stressors. Across the West, the habitat requirements of bat species are not really that well known. And so our ability to monitor this population at Dixie Mine is very rare. And we do believe that the bat that you see here in the image, Cornurinus townsendii, which is the pale Townsend's big-eared bat, is the primary species utilizing the mine. It has quite a large range. Geographically, it can be found in Canada and as south as central Mexico. This is a bat that forms maternity colonies in the summer, as I mentioned, but also requires suitable habitat for hibernating in the winter. And that might seem really quite unusual given that we're studying organisms in the Sonoran Desert where it never gets much below freezing, if at all, right? But the bats that we observe at Dixie Mine are considered obligate hibernators. It means that they have evolved to require using hibernation. And that means they need cold temperatures in the winter. They may leave the area and hibernate elsewhere. And some of these connections are really not at all understood. Where do they go when they're not at Dixie Mine? Okay, and then another very concerning event that has unfolded since 2006 is the emergence of the fungal disease that Melanie mentioned, white nose syndrome. So across North America, there are many populations that are declining due to white nose syndrome. And it is important for us to be monitoring all populations really in order to be able to detect impacts. If you're not very familiar with white nose syndrome, I thought having this map might be useful. So it first emerged near Albany, New York in 2006. That's where the red X is. This gradient of colors is showing you the sort of chronological spread of the fungus across the continent. Currently, according to the US Fish and Wildlife Service, there is no white nose syndrome or even the pathogen that causes it in Arizona. But there have been a few records of very, very low level detections of the pathogen, for example, in the Grand Canyon. Okay, so we expect the pathogen will arrive in Arizona. And this is another reason why studying bats at Dixie Mine under their sort of normal circumstances is really important. We want to understand them first before the disease impacts them. And we also want to be able to detect the impact by already having population counts, for example. Okay, so our overall Dixie Mine bat monitoring project has a major goal to assess the species, occurrences, and relative abundance of bats across seasons using the mine. We're also looking across years and testing for the effects of environmental conditions on bat abundance. We are using multiple methods, and the three main methods that we're using all have their own strengths. In general, across all three methods, we are asking these questions: which species are there? Why are they there? When are they there? Relatively, how many are there? We don't actually expect to get a true census, but we get relative counts. And then, of course, we can summarize across our findings using these different methods. The different methods that I'll mostly be focusing on today are Emergence Counts and Emergence Captures. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about these acoustic recordings that we do. Okay, so the emergence counts are where we very carefully set up two cameras facing the mine at different angles. We record using IR cameras. So these are like similar to Sony Night Shot. They detect IR light. We, use two cameras and record for 2.5 hours, starting at a half an hour before sunset up until 2 hours past sunset. The videos that result are visually reviewed by citizen scientists. Debbie Langenfeld has done every single count as far as I know, and then we've had other citizen scientists do sort of a repeat. Okay, so it's important for us to have multiple counts since this is kind of difficult looking at the footage. We also count back activity in as well as out of the mine. At sunset, we measure the temperature, relative humidity, cloud cover, precipitation, and wind speed just adjacent to the mine. And we also do that at the end of the emergence count, but I will mainly be talking about the data related to at sunset. And we do try and be extremely regular in the way we execute this in the field. So we do measure the distance from the mine gate to each of the cameras. We have them at the same heights. We have our IR lights kind of illuminating the gate at the same place each time. We hang our environmental logger in the same place each time as well. And this other one right here, this is one of our acoustic recorders that is in place, again, at the same spot each time. Here is a video showing some examples of the footage that results. Okay, so the bat that you just saw fly in front of your face would have been counted as an in, and then momentarily we'll see a bat exit. Okay, and that would be counted as one for out. But it's very difficult to know, is it the same bat going in as it is going out? That's why we do both and subtract in from out to get our relative count. Okay, for our emergence captures, we do this much less frequently. We've done these a few times, whereas the emergence recordings are done monthly. This is using a heart trap that is positioned in front of the mine, and the spaces around are blocked. That's why you see a lot of that fabric. The heart trap has parallel lines of fishing line, and the bats are unharmed. They get caught in the line and they fall into the bag that is positioned below, and then we can grab them by hand. And as you can see, we've done this a total of 6 times since 2016. When we really started our rigorous emergence recordings, that was in May of 2019, we got a really nice capture. And then we went and repeated that again just during this month in 2022. Okay, so what do we do when we have the bats in our hand? We do a lot of things with the main focus to properly ID the species. We determine the sex and the age. That's relative, adult versus juvenile, really. We collect a lot of measurements like the forearm length. The forearm is this long bone on the bat wing. We might collect the length of the ear. We may collect the length of the thumb. we also assess general condition. We examine the bats, we note if they have ectoparasites or if they look rough in any way. We determine their reproductive status, and you can palpate a bat to feel if it has a gestating fetus, and you can also palpate a bat to know if it's lactating. Finally, we do examine for evidence of white nose syndrome. In this place and at the active season time periods, this is mainly by looking for damage that could have occurred if the bat had been infected the previous winter. Okay, so we don't expect the infection to be noticeable at the mine, but we might see scarring. Fortunately, we haven't seen that. Okay. I'll very briefly say that we do these acoustic surveys as well. These always occur on the same day and for the same time period as those emergence counts using the cameras. We use 2 ultrasonic acoustic recorders, one deployed so that it's facing, the mic is facing the mine, and the other one adjacent to the mine, actually on the other side of the wash. And this is giving us a measure of more of the general bat activity in the area. Okay, and I'm not going to talk much about those results today. Okay, so the results I will talk about are really those based on the IR cameras, emergence counts, and the captures using the HARP traps. Okay, I'm going to start with the captures because to me this makes a lot of sense. Then everything is focused on one species. Our most recent capture was May 7th of this year. We caught 41 Townsend's big-eared bats. The species name is Cornurinus townsendii. All of the bats that we examined were pregnant or lactating, and some of them were quite close to full term. 2 of them probably had already given birth, showed evidence of lactation. 2 got away before we could examine them. But so what we think is that this is really a predominantly adult female maternity colony, and they are using Dixie mine as their maternity roost. Okay, so that is really, really exciting because these maternity roosts are quite rare. I know of one other one in the state, not that I've been here that long, but they're not easy to find. So having one on the preserved land is very important. It means we can more likely protect it because that land is already protected, right? And we have this really good opportunity to study and further protect the species. I should also mention that we have captured other species occasionally at the site. This includes Myotis vellifer, Myotis californicus, and Parastrellus hesperus. And I'm not going to show you the acoustic results as I mentioned, but Parastrellus hesperus, the canyon bat, is the one that we most frequently detect using the acoustic recorders. It seems to be flying over the area very frequently, though it does not appear to be using the mine itself as a maternity roost. All right, so turning to the results of the emergence counts using the cameras, we now have almost 3 years of nearly monthly data. We had a few snafus due to a fire and foxes toppling cameras, but mostly we have every single month for a solid 3 years, which I think is pretty phenomenal considering we've lived through a pandemic and done all of it, right? Okay, so here are some of the results. First, showing you some of our seasonal trends of mine usage by bats. So now I can say we can assume that most of these individuals we are counting using the cameras are Cornurinus townsendii, that pale Townsend's big-eared bat. And you can see that there are trends, right? There are peaks and troughs in the numbers of bats that we count leaving the mine. It depends on the year. The peaks tend to be somewhere around May, June for 2019. A little bit earlier in 2020, the peak was in March. We may have missed the peak in 2021. There are data where you don't see bars. Those are 0 bats counted out. And when we would have expected the peak in 2021, both of these nights, it was unseasonably windy or rainy or cold weather, okay? But then here we come over here. I'm going to jump over here for now. This is this year where we're seeing the peak return back to March, April. Okay. Okay, so if we consider the data from our hand captures and what we're seeing as far as counts using the camera data, it really does convincingly appear that Dixie mine is used as a maternity colony by the species. But you can see that bats are observed emerging from the mine during most months of the year, but with very little emergence in the winter, colder months. Okay, this is when we would expect for them to be in hibernation, probably somewhere else. The maximum number of bats we observed was 86. That was on May 31st, 2019. The minimum number of bats observed was 0 on each of these days where you do not see the bar. December, February, and March were the months. Okay, and yes, we do have a few survey dates that are missing due to some equipment malfunction. Again, we can blame the pandemic on that. A fire that prevented access, that was in August of 2020. And in November of 2020, foxes toppled both of our cameras mid-recording. Okay, now I'm going to turn to a brief view of some of the preliminary statistical analysis we've done. I mentioned to you that we collect environmental data like the temperature and the wind speed at sunset. What we want to know is what explains those trends in bat counts leaving the mine. Is it seasonality? Is it temperature? Is it some other environmental variable? And so far, what we've used is an approach using generalized linear models, GLM for short, and using many different sort of variations of the models with different regressions. You don't need to worry about this, but Poisson regressions are used for count data, and that's our data. And so far, the best fitting model, according to something called the Ake-Ike information criterion, includes kind of a bunch of predictor variables, including temperature, humidity, cloud cover, and wind speed. Across all of at least the top ranking models, temperature seems to rise to the top and have the largest beta or the biggest effect compared to the other factors. Okay, so we'll take a moment and look a little bit more at that. Right now, what I'm plotting for you is simply temperature adjacent to the mine in Celsius on the survey date, so at sunset and across all of our survey dates. And you can see, as would be expected, we have highs and lows as well. Okay, but I'd like to show you the counts aligned with the temperature data. In some ways, you can see peaks sort of aligning with high temperatures, right? But not entirely, right? So here we are at the end of our current set of dates. We didn't yet have very high temperatures in March and April of this year, but we did already have sort of a peak in bat counts. Okay, so I'm going to look at this in a slightly different way, which is to plot the number of bats exiting Dixie mine according to the temperature at sunset adjacent to the mine. And this is where it gets really complicated, and we think simple linear regression may not be the best choice. Okay, so if you look at sort of the lower half of this figure, you can see a rough curve. It appears that fewer bats emerge from the mine during very hot temperatures or very cold evenings, except when there is peak abundance. Okay, and the peak abundance would correspond when the adult females are pregnant and lactating, and they must leave the mine and feed every night to have sufficient resources, sufficient energy. Okay. Another thing that came to my attention is this wide range of about 30 degrees centigrade, across which we see those highest bat counts. Okay, so one of the hypotheses could be that if they are not like smack dab in the middle of pregnancy or lactation, they may be able to make some choices and leave when the temperatures are more moderate versus when they are pregnant and lactating, they may have no choice but to go out no matter how cold or how hot it is. Okay, and I'm just throwing this out there as a hypothesis and suggesting that seasonality in reproductive timing, as well as specific environmental conditions like temperature, may both drive bat abundance at the mine. And the modeling is not done. We will be testing a different type of model that is not so bound to linear regression. It's called additive modeling, and it allows for smoother fits between the data points. Okay, and we will also be adding, we'll be adding some weather station data as well. Okay, so our efforts are generating a baseline data set for the bat population at Dixie Mine, mostly using passive methods with some direct handling to really confirm species and to confirm reproductive status. We are really generally contributing to bat conservation by increasing the knowledge on the habitat requirements, especially of the pale Townsend's big-eared bat. And we are quantifying population size and temporal variation, how the presence of bats varies over time, and using this basically a baseline, we will be able to detect possible future impacts due to stressors that may be white nose syndrome or something else like climate change. Okay, and finally, the next steps we have identified for right now is to potentially modify our methods for long-term monitoring. It is a lot to go out monthly, right? And we may not need to go out every single month of the year. Now that we have a 3-year data set, we can really consider that and adjust if we think it's reasonable. And we are currently working on a paper to publish these first three years of results to really present the phenology, as has been mentioned a couple of times today, of especially the Cornurinus townsendii. Okay, and with that, I'll take any questions if there's time. Hopefully I did okay on my timing.
Yes, we have several questions. One is precautions used when you're handling the bats. You obviously are wearing some kind of handwear.
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, and my lab does a lot of work in other parts of the state during hibernation when the bats could be infected if the pathogen were here. So we take extra precautions. When we're touching the bats, we have, depends on the species and the level of experience a person has, but usually we'll have one hand that's gloved. This is sort of early days now, especially with COVID and PD, which is the short term for the white nose syndrome pathogen. We actually put a nitrile glove over our handling gloves. Okay, so we'll have 2 nitrile gloves. We wear N95s. And at this point, that is more to protect the bats from us because we could potentially transmit SARS-CoV-2 to them. Does that help?
Thank you, yes.
Yes.
Where are the male bats when the females are occupying the mine?
That's a great question. So bats do have a very interesting timing for their reproductive activities. They actually probably mostly mate in the fall before they go into hibernation. And the females are able to keep the sperm alive and viable. The females have a specialized uterus. It secretes glycogen and provides energy to the sperm. Around the end of hibernation, this species would allow fertilization to occur. So then once the females arrive at Dixie Mine or their maternity colony elsewhere, they're pregnant. And then they carry out, the full gestation and provisioning, et cetera. The males don't have to be anywhere for that period of time, right? So mating can occur during fall swarming is what we call it, when males and females really get together. Mating can also occur in hibernation. So the males could be more distributed across the landscape. Probably relatively close to a source of water for them to drink nightly. But it's also, yeah, it's good for them to be spread out. They're not going to compete against the females or the young.
Another question relates to environmental conditions. The counts are done within 4 days of the new moon. There must be a good reason for that. And another related question, how do the bats determine what the outside temperature is when they're in a fixed environment with a stable temperature?
Yeah, excellent questions. Okay, so regarding the new moon, not for this species, but other bat species are known to change their behaviors in correlation with the amount of light from the moon, so the moon phase. And we don't know if these bat species do that, but we wanted to avoid that as a potential sort of confounder, like complicating our results. So if we do our recordings right around the new moon, give or take a few days, then it's always really, really dark. We know the amount of light is consistent across our emergence counts. Unfortunately, at the mine, there isn't a lot of light from the city, right? Especially because you're kind of tucked down into the wash. The other question, what was my other question?
Is the temperature
The
determination by the
temperature,
bats?
yeah. So, okay. I mean, I don't have an exact answer for that question, right? I don't know what the bats are doing in the mine. We don't know exactly where the maternity cluster is. But one thing that we do observe is that not all bats leave exactly at the same time, and the emergence usually starts off fairly quiet. It seems like, and this is something else that's been noticed with other bat species, is that there might be one scout that comes to sort of test the conditions, and then it could fly back to the cluster and report back. So there does seem to be some amount of coordinated behavior. I mean, that's really anecdotal and something that would be really, really hard to measure. Another thing we don't know well is the airflow within the mine. So it is possible that some of the ventilation that occurs within the mine could give them that information without them actually leaving. Yeah.
Is it helpful that Fountain Hills is a dark sky town?
I would guess so, yes. So I did mention that our cameras, were really tucked down into the wash, but keeping that whole area darker than the rest of the urbanized area. Again, not for the species of bat, but other studies have shown bats also change their behavior depending on the amount of light, right? And then Jesse Dwyer's work, which is showing how they may change their behaviors due to urbanization. So the more sort of natural we can, the natural conditions we can maintain, the better for understanding what these species do before we interfere. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Marianne.